The Samaritan woman at the well. Yes, I'm going to head straight for it. No prefatory banter for me. We owe this story to the Gospel of John, which otherwise shows no interest in Samaritans, tax collectors, or how Jesus regarded them. Normally in the Christian Testament, Luke is where we hear about Samaritans and where we get a certain kind of story about tax collectors. Luke tells us about a Pharisee thanking God that the Pharisee is righteous and good, unlike this degenerate tax collector doing the dirty work for the empire. Later, he tells us about 10 lepers healed by Jesus, only one of whom, the Samaritan, thanks Jesus for healing him. So Jesus ruefully says, "The other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God, except this foreigner?" A bit later, Luke tells the story of the Good Samaritan, which is so famous and sentimentalized, we often miss the shock that's in it. Luke is distinctly and remarkably generous to Samaritans and tax collectors. The Samaritan and tax collector stories in Luke convey his perspective on how Jesus related to the denigrated, the poor, the outcasts, and the despised. The Gospel of Mark has only one story about tax collectors, the calling of Levi and the dinner at his house, and nothing about Samaritans. Matthew mentions tax collectors quite often, acknowledging that Jesus did eat with them, but Matthew conveys no sympathy whatsoever for them. In fact, Matthew has Jesus warning not to be like the Samaritans, heathens, and tax collectors, and don't preach to them either. John has no interest in the tax collector trope, and his only Samaritan story is the woman at Jacob's well. But what a motherlode of real-world spirituality it is. The Bible is rarely accommodating, at least straightforwardly accommodating, to our liturgical seasons, ceremonies, and special occasions. Here we are on the 5th Sunday after Epiphany for Evensong, and to do some cathedral business. But at worship, we grapple with texts from a far-off time and place in ancient languages. The scriptures are cryptic and multivalent, polyphonic and layered, brimming with different kinds of meaning. Narrative, poetic, proverbial, parabolic, eschatological, just piling perspectives on each other. The Bible begins with 2 creation stories stitched together and contains occasional glosses on the Babylonian story of Marduk's slaying of the sea goddess. It thinks nothing of conflating a pro-monarchical rendering of the story of Samuel, Saul, and David with an anti-monarchical version of the same story. It gives us a stream of texts that endorse imperial ambition and sacred violence, another stream that is anti-imperial and justice-oriented, but still inclined to sanctify violence, and another stream that is justice-oriented and opposed to violence. I don't believe there is one right way to deal with the overflowing multiplicity of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. In some cases, we need to make a choice. In others, we rest with multiplicity. Religions are traditions of faith and practice that help us find our way. In any faith tradition, when we attend to scriptural texts, we listen for words that open a larger world to us, opening us to a revelatory experience. Certainly it happened to the woman at the well. Christianity grew out of Second Temple Judaism. Nearly everything in the teaching of Jesus, except love your enemies, can be traced to Hebrew faith. And the scholarly quest for the historical Jesus never did agree on how much Hellenistic wisdom he may have absorbed. But something deeply important in the moral core of Hebrew faith and Christianity is registered in these gospel texts revolving around Samaritans and tax collectors who were accused of collaborating with the empire. Welcome the strangers and the outcasts. Pour yourself out for the lowly and despised. The fact that these Samaritan stories are rare and isolated in the Christian Testament shows that they were hard to swallow. The hatred between Jews and Samaritans was fueled by centuries of mutual resentment, bitter epithets, and rival stories about who truly belongs and who sold out. The Samaritans were excluded from building the second temple in Jerusalem. They built their own temple near Shechem, and they claimed to be true followers of the Lord, accepting the 5 books of Moses, but not the prophets and the later writings, which they rejected as Jewish propaganda. The Jews claimed the Samaritans were descendants of the colonists, whom the king of Assyria, Shalmaneser, brought from Babylon and other lands after he conquered Samaria and deported the native population. Samaritans, in this telling, were half-breed foreigners and collaborators whose claim to Jewish belief was offensive. The Samaritans said they were descendants of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. The deportation of 721 BCE was not total or final, and Ezra and Nehemiah were wrong to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. The Jews destroyed the Samaritan temple, feeling totally justified, and the Samaritans desecrated the Jewish temple at Passover with human bones, parading their contempt. It got worse than ever just before the time of Jesus. Through this wall of hatred and contempt, no word was allowed to pass in Samaria. Jesus stops at Jacob's well in Samaria, asking a woman for a drink. She is stunned because Jews don't speak to Samaritans. This story features the longest piece of dialogue in the entire Christian Testament. It makes odd twists and turns. Jesus engages the woman in a rambling, kind of loopy conversation about husbands, water that you drink, and living water that saves you. The words pile up, but only after Jesus and the woman have negotiated the hard, cold silence of an awkward encounter between a Samaritan woman and a Jewish man. This story about rival narratives, bitter hatred, racism, imperial conquest, and unwelcome foreigners is too much for our moment. Our nation has long told an idealistic story about itself that tries to say as little as possible about the genocide of First Nation peoples, a horrendous system of chattel slavery, the most vicious racial caste system in the entire Americas, plus wave after wave of anti-immigrant crusades that dehumanize whichever group is the current object of loathing. A few years ago, I wrote a big book on the history of European social democracy, and 2 years later, I wrote an equally big one on the U.S.-American history of the same subject. The biggest difference between these two stories was the incredible cultural diversity pervading the American story, which has no parallel in any European nation or all of them put together. Reckoning with the tragedies, raucous diversity, and traumas of our nation's history can feel like too much for any of us. And for many, it is intolerable. Can't talk about that. Don't want to hear it. But even the liberating, creative, redemptive parts of our story cannot be appreciated if we aren't willing to engage what our freedom movements struggled against. That is what hit me about the civil rights movement. I grew up poor and rural in mid-Michigan during the years of the civil rights movement. My teachers described the USA as the world's greatest nation in every way and the greatest ever. But if that was true, why were black children marching in Birmingham, Alabama, risking their lives? The movement was jarring, daring, beautiful, controversial, reviled, and searing. It abounded with noble visions, resounded with soaring rhetoric, ended in nightmarish despair, and does not end. It sang and preached and marched for a better world. To me, this story surpasses all other American stories. It crashed through my trailer park world and put me on an unlikely path. Most of us who are involved in the justice work of the church can name a similar formative experience. For some, it was the feminist or liberation theology movements of the 1970s, or the nuclear freeze or ecumenical sanctuary movements of the 1980s, or the gay rights or cultural identity movements of the 1990s. We called all of them movements, while realizing that none of them were mass movements like those that preceded us in the 1960s. Many of us felt the difference. Then came what we thought would be called the age of Obama, which didn't quite happen. Obama was gifted and cautious. He was not a fighter, even for things he wanted, yet he was soon frustrated. Everything that his presidency might have been about became secondary to the pathos of his presidency. Obama sowed a ferocious backlash merely by living in the White House and doing his job. Many of our students today came of age when idealistic talk about a post-racial future symbolized by Obama gave way to anxious talk about losing our way. Then it became undeniable that our nation has lost its way. When I ask my students how they awoke to their time, many of them say it was the first time they heard the name of Michael Brown, cut down in Ferguson, or Breonna Taylor, cut down in her bedroom. Then COVID-19 swept the world with stunning, sweeping, devastating brutality. Feelings of anxiety, fear, and vulnerability that many black and brown Americans experience as normal life became, for a while, the daily bread of nearly all Americans. The epidemic surged in every direction, piling up bodies in makeshift morgues. Yet smack in the middle of it, surging crowds poured into the streets to protest the killing of George Floyd. My beloved friend, Kelly Brown Douglas, on 2 occasions, has written a book that pressed the question whether she could remain a Christian. Each time, she wasn't sure of the answer until she reached the end of the book. She raised her son Desmond on her womanist theology. Blackness is a symbol of liberation, and liberation is the essence of the divine nature, so God is black. When George Floyd was killed, Desmond said to his mother, "I get it, God is black, but that doesn't seem to be helping us." It stunned Kelly to think that her son might be right. Did she have a Christian response? Then she witnessed the spectacular protests against losing George Floyd, and she wrote a book titled Resurrection Hope. We need a moral imaginary, she said, that's big enough and hopeful enough to be a vehicle of God's just future. when Jesus knocks down the wall separating him from the Samaritan woman. She seems to be startled. "Who are you to ask for water from me?" They banter about living water. It sounds pretty good to her, so he says, "Call your husband," which is impossible because she's had 5 husbands and is now with someone else. Many bad sermons have been preached against this woman for divorcing all these men and living in sin. But women in the ancient world had no right to divorce. She has been shamed by a system that has left her with no say in what happens to her. Last Sunday at Riverside Church, my cherished union colleague, Andrea White, gave a sermon on this same text, which drove to a crucial point. This Samaritan woman is despised, totally othered, and goes nameless, yet Jesus treats her with a taken-for-granted respect. Jesus is not shaming her, but he does call out the issue in her life. So she changes the subject. "All right, let's discuss theology. You Jews worship in Jerusalem, and we Samaritans worship on the mountain. Isn't that a fascinating difference? What do you think about it?" Jesus says the day is coming when the mountain and the temple will not matter at all. What will matter is your worship in spirit and truth. In spirit, because God is spirit, and the form of spirit is personal, and the content of spirit is love divine. In truth, which requires courage and honesty. The Spirit of God has a gift for each of us. God gives the gift and keeps giving it for the sake of others. At Union Theological Seminary, we don't get as many students from Christian backgrounds as we used to. We are getting, perhaps more than ever, students who are curious about religion and who hunger for spiritual presence in their lives. Religions are symbolically charged apprehensions of meaning, fallible approaches to the mystery of life that transcends our understanding. Spirituality is what we do to become aware, to open ourselves and become connected to powers of life that already sustain us. Religions are responses to the primal awe of the gift of life. All have a dangerous tendency to sacralize dogmatism, violence, and oppression. Yet all religions are potential vehicles of transforming moral energy, bearers of moral creativity, and a sense of the sacred that resists commodification, meanness, domination, and separation. The first time that I worshiped at this cathedral, I was a student at Union Seminary. I had never joined a church, but I was getting ready to do it. And I felt more ready than ever because I was halfway through a book titled Nature, Man, and God by William Temple. The book enthralled me. Temple had been the Archbishop of Canterbury during World War II. He was a Logos theologian, a social democrat, and a neo-Hegelian, just like me. He grew up in castles, but that didn't faze me. He was eloquent, spiritually deep, and buoyant, a light to many. He had a gift for theological summary. Spirit is the nature of the supreme reality that created all things. The will of Christ is one with the will of God and expressive of it, but not identical with it. Will and personality are ideally interchangeable terms. I brought his book with me because this place is huge and I was insecure. If this guy is an Anglican, I thought, I could be an Anglican. St. John the Divine, under our luminous new dean, has embarked on a magnificent new era, and I have no idea if I can contribute anything of value to Winnie's ministry here. I have no doubt that Kelly can. Whether I can, I don't know. But I'm grateful to try. I was caught long ago by the gospel picture of the divine word entering the world. I am held by the gospel message that God suffered with us and for us in Jesus, and that we are called to seek first the commonwealth of God and God's righteousness. 2 Peter says it best. God's divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and goodness, that through these we may overcome the violence that is in the world and become partakers of the divine nature.